If you have ever felt invisible in a room full of important people, stay until the end of this video, because what happened at table 15 on a rainy Tuesday night proves that the smallest person in the room can carry the biggest heart. Before we start, if stories about second chances and quiet heroes move you the way they move me, hit that subscribe button and tap the like. It truly helps this story reach the people who need it tonight. Now, let's step into the restaurant. The rain had not stopped since noon, and Daniel Reyes had exactly $14 left in his bank account when he walked into the Hollow Oak, a restaurant so polished it made his second-hand shoes feel like a confession. He wasn't there to eat. He was there to work. A 2-hour shift covering for a friend on the valet team, parking cars that cost more than his apartment building. His daughter, Lily, was 7 years old, asleep at a neighbor's house with a nebulizer machine humming beside her bed. And every dollar Daniel earned that night was already spoken for before it hit his pocket. Daniel had not always been a man who counted coins on a kitchen counter at midnight. 3 years earlier, he had been a mechanical draftsman with a decent salary, a wife named Carol who sang off-key in the shower, and a daughter who thought her father could fix anything. Then Carol got sick, the bills swallowed his savings whole, and one gray February morning she simply didn't wake up. Grief did not knock politely. It kicked the door down and rearranged the furniture of his entire life. He lost the house first, then the car, then most of his pride, but he never once let go of Lily's hand. He worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, driven not by ambition but by a single vow he whispered to his daughter every night: "I will always come back for you." Money was not the only thing grief had taken from him. It had also taken the version of Daniel who used to laugh easily, who used to believe that if you worked hard and stayed honest, the world eventually noticed. These days, the world mostly looked past him. He had become fluent in the particular invisibility of service workers, the way wealthy patrons could look directly at him while asking for their car keys and somehow never see his face at all. He had learned to swallow his exhaustion behind a polite smile, to nod at instructions barked by men half his age, to disappear into the uniform the moment he put it on. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It was survival. Bitterness cost energy he didn't have, and every ounce of energy Daniel possessed belonged to Lily. Lily's asthma had worsened that winter. 2 trips to the emergency room in 6 weeks, each one draining an account that never had much to drain in the first place. Her pediatrician had mentioned, gently, that a newer combination inhaler might reduce the frequency of her attacks, the kind of medication that cost more per month than Daniel's electricity bill. He had started picking up the valet shifts specifically to cover it, working himself past exhaustion in a parking lot full of cars that probably cost more than his entire life savings ever had. Also, his daughter could breathe a little easier at night. It was, he often thought, a strange kind of arithmetic, trading his own body's limits for hers. That night, between parking a Bentley and jogging back through the rain for a Mercedes, Daniel's manager waved him inside for 15 minutes to warm up and grab a glass of water. A small mercy on a miserable night. He slipped through the kitchen door into the dining room, careful not to draw attention. And that was when he noticed him, the man at table 15. Everyone in the city knew that face. Richard Calloway, CEO of Calloway Dynamics, a man whose net worth had a comma in a place most people's salaries never reached. He was seated with 3 board members in tailored suits, laughing at something, champagne glasses catching the low amber light. From a distance, he looked like a man who had never once worried about anything in his life. But Daniel noticed things other people missed. It was a habit grief had carved into him, a hyper-awareness of the small cracks beneath composed faces, because he wore that same mask every single day. The 3 board members with him, Marcus Voss, sharp-suited and perpetually checking his watch, Eleanor Pratt, whose smile never once reached past her teeth, and a younger executive named Corbin, who laughed a half-second too late at everything Marcus said, had spent the last 20 minutes discussing, in tones just quiet enough to seem discreet and just loud enough for anyone listening to understand exactly what was happening, the upcoming leadership vote. Callaway Dynamics was expanding into 3 new markets, and there were whispers, carefully seeded over months by Marcus himself, that Richard's instincts had gone soft, that the board needed someone more aggressive at the helm. Richard had spent the entire dinner performing confidence for an audience that was quietly measuring him for a replacement. Richard's laugh did not reach his eyes. His hand trembled slightly around the stem of his glass. And then, while his colleagues were distracted by a phone ringing across the table, Richard picked up a black pen from his breast pocket, pulled a folded cocktail napkin toward himself, and wrote something in quick, jagged letters before sliding it beneath his palm. Daniel was 20 feet away, but his eyes had always been sharp, and for one flickering second before Richard covered it completely, Daniel read 4 letters, help. His first instinct was disbelief. Powerful men did not write help on napkins in 5-star restaurants. Surely it was a joke, a code word between old business partners, a doodle. But then Daniel saw Richard's face in full for the first time that night. Pale beneath the tan, a thin sheen of sweat at his hairline despite the restaurant's cool air conditioning. His left hand pressed flat against his ribs beneath the table, where no one else could see. His breathing was too careful, too measured, the way a person breathes when they are trying very hard not to let anyone know something is wrong. Daniel had seen that exact look before. He had seen it on Carol's face in the weeks before the hospital, when she kept insisting she was just tired because she didn't want to frighten him. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and in that instant, whatever hesitation Daniel might have felt about approaching a billionaire in a restaurant that would never let a valet through the front door evaporated completely. He did not shout, he did not point. He walked, calm and steady, weaving between white tablecloths as though he had every right to be there, and knelt beside Richard's chair under the pretense of adjusting a floor lamp cord no one had asked him to touch. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, so only Richard could hear him. "Your napkin. I saw it. Are you having chest pain?" Richard's eyes snapped to him, first with panic, then with something closer to relief so profound it nearly broke his composure entirely. He gave the smallest nod, terrified of drawing the attention of the 3 board members still laughing 2 feet away. Men who were, at that very moment, circling like sharks over a leadership vote that could end Richard's career if they smelled even a hint of weakness. "I can't let them see," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "If they think I'm sick, the vote tomorrow. They'll replace me by morning. Please, I just need air. Quietly." Daniel understood immediately. This was not simply a medical emergency. It was a man drowning twice, once in his own body, and once in the fear of what the world would do to him the second he showed a single sign of being human. Daniel had felt that particular drowning many times himself. The fear that if anyone saw how close to breaking he actually was, everything he had left would be taken from him too. "Lean on me like we're old friends," Daniel murmured, sliding an arm under Richard's shoulder with practiced gentleness. "Tell them you need to step out for a call." Richard, gathering the last scraps of his composure, forced a smile toward the table. "Board approval call from Tokyo, gentlemen. You know how they love an inconvenient hour. Excuse me a moment." The men barely looked up from their conversation, waving him off with the careless confidence of people who had never once imagined the world without him in it. Daniel walked Richard through a side hallway, past the restrooms, out through an emergency exit into the alley where the rain was falling in silver sheets under the streetlight. The moment the door closed behind them, Richard's legs buckled, and only Daniel's arm kept him from hitting the wet pavement. "Talk to me," Daniel said, lowering him carefully against the brick wall, pressing 2 fingers to Richard's wrist to check his pulse. Too fast, too shallow. "Where does it hurt?" "Chest," Richard gasped. "Left arm. It started 20 minutes ago. I thought it would pass. I can't go to a hospital tonight. Not before the vote. They'll say I'm unfit. "You're going to a hospital," Daniel said, already dialing emergency services with his free hand, his voice firm in a way that surprised even himself. "A vote means nothing if you're dead by morning. Your daughter needs you alive more than your company needs you unquestioned." He didn't know Richard had a daughter. He was simply speaking from the deepest well of his own truth, the one lesson grief had carved into his bones. Nothing was worth more than being alive for the people who loved you. Something in those words landed on Richard like a stone dropped into still water. His eyes, glassy with pain, focused on Daniel's face, really focused, as though seeing another human being clearly for the first time in years, rather than a uniform, a job title, a service to be summoned and dismissed. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later. Daniel rode alongside, gripping Richard's hand because the older man had asked him to, whispering that he didn't want to be alone, that everyone around him were shareholders and lawyers, and no one, not one single person, in that restaurant was someone who would actually hold his hand. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed a severe cardiac episode brought on by chronic, untreated stress, the kind of stress that accumulates silently over a decade of 60-hour weeks, hostile takeovers, and a life built so entirely around performance that Richard had forgotten somewhere along the way how to simply be afraid out loud. He was lucky. 10 more minutes without intervention, the cardiologist said, and the outcome would have been very different. Somewhere around 1 a.m., in the fluorescent hush of the cardiac ward, Richard began to talk, the way people sometimes do after they've been shown, in the clearest possible terms, that they are not invincible. He told Daniel about his own daughter, Beatrice, 26 now and living in Portland, who hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years because he had missed her college graduation for a merger meeting that, in hindsight, changed nothing about anyone's life except hers. He told Daniel about the company he'd built from a single patent and a rented garage, and how somewhere in the climb from nothing to everything, he had convinced himself that rest was for people who could afford to lose. He talked about the pills he'd started keeping in his desk drawer for the chest tightness he'd been ignoring for 8 months, always promising himself he'd see a cardiologist after the next quarter. "I used to think if I ever slowed down everything would collapse," Richard admitted, staring at the ceiling tiles. "Tonight I found out the opposite is true. It was going to collapse anyway. I was just too proud to let anyone see it happening." Daniel didn't offer platitudes. He had learned, in the year after Carol died, that most comforting phrases were designed to make the comforter feel better, not the grieving person. Instead, he simply said, "My wife used to say the same thing, that stopping felt like losing. She stopped anyway in the end, not by choice. I'd give anything for her to have had a night like tonight instead. A warning. A chance." His voice caught slightly. "You got a warning, Mr. Calloway. Most people don't." Daniel stayed until 2 a.m. Not because anyone asked him to, but because some part of him could not walk away from a frightened man clutching a hospital blanket, the way Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit during thunderstorms. When Richard finally drifted into medicated sleep, Daniel slipped out quietly, called a rideshare he genuinely could not afford, and went home to relieve his neighbor, arriving just in time to hear Lily's nebulizer machine click off for the night. He kissed her forehead, whispered that he loved her, and fell asleep in his work clothes, never once thinking that the stranger he'd helped in an alley would come looking for him. But Richard did look. It took his assistant 3 days of reviewing valet shift logs, restaurant security footage, and quiet, careful questions to track down the man who had saved his life and then vanished into the rain without leaving a name. When they finally found Daniel, living in a modest 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, working 2 jobs, raising a daughter with severe asthma alone, Richard insisted on visiting in person, against the advice of every assistant and board member who told him it was beneath his position. Richard arrived without security detail, without a driver, wearing a plain gray coat instead of a tailored suit, and knocked on Daniel's door like an ordinary man asking to be let in from the cold. Daniel opened it, stunned into silence, Lily peeking out curiously from behind his leg. "You saved my life," Richard said simply, "and you didn't even stay long enough to let me say thank you." "You didn't need thanking," Daniel replied. "You needed help. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Richard said, his voice low and certain. "They wouldn't have. I've had 200 employees walk past me every single day for a decade. Not one of them ever looked closely enough to see I was drowning. You did, and you weren't even one of my employees. You were parking cars in the rain for tips." The two men talked for hours that evening, Lily eventually falling asleep against her father's shoulder, while the billionaire and the single dad sat on mismatched kitchen chairs, drinking instant coffee from chipped mugs. Richard learned about Carol, about the mounting hospital bills from Lily's asthma treatments, about the drafting job Daniel had lost when the economy shifted and never quite managed to reclaim. Daniel, in turn, learned that the most powerful man in 3 industries had been utterly, achingly alone, surrounded by people who wanted something from him, and starved for a single person who simply wanted to know he was okay. Richard offered money that first night, and Daniel refused it, not out of foolish pride, but because he had learned the hard way that charity given too quickly rarely lasts, and he did not want Lily to grow up believing rescue always comes from someone else's wallet. Instead, Richard asked a different question. What did you actually want to do with your life before everything fell apart? Daniel admitted, almost embarrassed, that he had once dreamed of designing accessible housing, homes built for aging parents and disabled children, homes that didn't force families like his into choosing between stairs and dignity. It was a dream he'd buried under funeral costs and medical bills years ago. Richard did not write a check that night. Instead, over the following 3 weeks, he did something that surprised his own assistants far more than any acquisition ever had. He simply kept showing up. He came by Daniel's apartment on a Sunday with 2 coffees and sat on the fire escape, while Lily showed him her collection of rocks she insisted were probably meteorites. He asked real questions and remembered the answers. The name of Lily's pediatrician, the model of nebulizer that kept jamming, the fact that Daniel hadn't touched his old drafting tools in 3 years because looking at them reminded him of a future he'd stopped believing he was allowed to have. One evening, Richard brought over a battered folder of blueprints from Callaway Dynamics' abandoned community development wing, a division shelved 5 years earlier when the board decided it wasn't profitable enough to justify the overhead. He spread the pages across Daniel's kitchen table, next to the chipped mugs, and asked a single question. If I gave you the resources and got out of your way, what would you actually build? Daniel talked for 2 hours straight, sketching on the back of a grocery receipt because it was the only paper within reach, describing homes where a wheelchair could turn in a bathroom without scraping paint off the walls, where grandparents could live with their families instead of being sent away, where a single dad wouldn't have to choose between a second-floor apartment he could afford and a ground-floor one his daughter could safely reach during an asthma attack. Richard listened without interrupting once, and when Daniel finally stopped, embarrassed at how much he'd said, Richard simply told him, "That's the division. Build it." 3 weeks later, he offered Daniel a formal position in Callaway Dynamics' newly relaunched community housing division. A real job, with a real salary, built around a real skill Daniel actually possessed, not a handout dressed up as generosity. He insisted Daniel interview like any other candidate, and Daniel, characteristically stubborn, insisted on it too, sitting across from 3 unimpressed department heads who had no idea their new colleague had once held their CEO's hand in an ambulance. The story could have ended there, a tidy bow on a lucky encounter. But life, as Daniel had learned from bitter experience, rarely moves in straight lines. 2 months into his new role, the very board members who had been laughing beside Richard that rainy night launched a hostile campaign, using his hospitalization as ammunition, whispering that a man with a weak heart could not be trusted to lead a company through its next expansion. Marcus Voss led the charge, framing it not as cruelty but as prudence, telling reporters off the record that shareholders deserve a leader whose health won't jeopardize a $2 billion expansion. Eleanor Pratt quietly lined up proxy votes in the weeks leading up to the meeting, calling longtime investors under the guise of routine check-ins. They moved for an emergency vote to strip Richard of his position, citing liability concerns, painting his vulnerability as incompetence, and scheduling the vote with barely 72 hours' notice, hoping to catch Richard still recovering and unprepared to fight back. Richard, to Daniel's frustration, seemed almost ready to let them win. "Maybe they're right," he admitted quietly, the week before the vote, sitting in his office long after everyone else had gone home. "Maybe a man who nearly died at a dinner table has no business steering a company this size. I spent 30 years terrified of looking weak, and the one time I actually was, it turned out I was right to be afraid." Daniel had never heard him sound so defeated, not even in the ambulance. "You're confusing two different things," Daniel told him. "Being afraid of dying and being unfit to live are not the same sentence. You didn't fail that night. You survived it. There's a difference, and if you let them convince you otherwise, you're doing their job for them." Daniel watched this unfold from his new office on the 14th floor, and something inside him refused to stay silent. On the morning of the board vote, uninvited and technically far too junior to be in the room, Daniel walked into the executive boardroom carrying nothing but a folded cocktail napkin he had kept, quietly, in his wallet since that rainy night. "You want to know if this man is fit to lead," Daniel said, his voice steady despite every eye in the room turning toward him with open hostility. "I was the only person in that restaurant who noticed he was dying at your table. Not one of you looked up from your champagne. He wrote 4 letters on a napkin because he was too afraid of you to say them out loud. That's not weakness. That's what happens when the people around a man make him believe that needing help is a fireable offense." He set the napkin gently on the polished table. "I've raised a daughter alone through the worst year of my life, and the one thing I know for certain is that strength isn't the absence of struggle. It's what a person does after the struggle nearly kills them." Richard Calloway got back up. "The question isn't whether he's fit to lead. The question is whether any of you would have had the decency to notice if the roles were reversed." The boardroom fell silent in a way conference rooms rarely do. Marcus Voss opened his mouth to object to Daniel's presence entirely. Some procedural complaint about junior staff addressing the board uninvited, but Eleanor Pratt, of all people, raised a hand to stop him, her eyes fixed on the folded napkin sitting in the center of the polished table like evidence in a trial no one had expected to actually witness. One by one, board members who had arrived that morning fully prepared to oust their CEO found themselves unable to meet Daniel's eyes. The vote, when it finally happened, was not close. Richard remained at the helm of Calloway Dynamics, not because he had hidden his humanity, but because for the first time, he had let someone witness it, and that witness had refused to let it be used against him. Marcus Voss resigned from the board 6 months later, quietly, without incident, taking a position at a smaller firm where colleagues said he seemed noticeably less interested in other people's weaknesses. Eleanor Pratt, unexpectedly, became one of the community housing division's strongest advocates on the board, telling Daniel once over coffee that watching him stand up for Richard had reminded her of her own father, a union electrician who'd spent 40 years believing that dignity wasn't something you were handed. It was something you insisted on, out loud, in rooms that would rather you stayed quiet. In the months that followed, Richard quietly funded a full medical trust for Lily's ongoing asthma treatment, not as charity, but as what he called a business investment in the only employee who ever actually told me the truth. Daniel's accessible housing division broke ground on its first project by spring. 40 units designed specifically for aging parents and children with mobility challenges, the very dream Daniel had buried years earlier now rising, floor by floor, out of a vacant lot on the east side of the city. Richard began attending therapy, quietly, without press releases or public statements, learning at 52 years old what it meant to ask for help before a napkin became necessary. He called his daughter Beatrice the week after the board vote, not to apologize with a gift or a gesture, but simply to say he was sorry and that he wanted to know her life again, however long it took to earn that back. It took months of careful, humble effort, but by autumn, Beatrice flew in for a weekend, and Richard introduced her to Daniel and Lily over a dinner that had nothing to do with business at all. Just 4 people, mismatched but somehow fitting, eating too much pasta at Daniel's kitchen table, because Richard had insisted the fire escape needed better chairs and bought them all himself. He and Daniel remained close, not employer and employee in the way either of them first expected, but something closer to family, bound together by a rainy Tuesday and 4 scrawled letters that could have ended so differently. Richard often said, half joking but not entirely, that Daniel was the only person at Callaway Dynamics who had never once asked him for anything, and that was precisely why he trusted him with everything. The 40-unit housing project was named, at Richard's insistence and over Daniel's embarrassed objections, Reyes Commons. On the day it broke ground, Daniel stood in a hard hat 2 sizes too big, holding a shovel he had no idea how to use gracefully, surrounded by future residents who had come simply to watch the first shovel of dirt turn. An elderly veteran who'd been searching for an accessible apartment for 2 years, a mother whose son used a wheelchair, and had never once lived somewhere with a doorway wide enough to fit it through without scraping his knuckles. Daniel found himself unexpectedly emotional, watching strangers cry over blueprints he had once sketched on the back of a grocery receipt at his own kitchen table. Lily, now 8, still keeps a framed photograph on her nightstand, her father in a hard hat at the housing site groundbreaking, a tall, gray-haired man beside him with his hand on Daniel's shoulder, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. She likes to tell people the story of how her dad saved a billionaire with nothing but a floor lamp and a kind word, though she always adds, proudly, that her dad would have done it even if the man at table 15 had been nobody at all. And that, in the end, is the truest part of this story. Daniel never knew who Richard Callaway was when he knelt beside that chair. He only knew that someone was drowning quietly in a room full of people too busy to notice, and he could not walk past that, no matter how tired he was, no matter how little he had left to give. It is easy to believe that the world only rewards the loud, the powerful, the visible. But sometimes the person parking cars in the rain, the one nobody bothers to look at twice, is the only one paying close enough attention to save a life, and in saving it, quietly save their own. If this story reminded you that kindness doesn't need permission, or a title, or a bank balance to matter, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Share it with someone who needs to hear that showing up for a stranger can change everything. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.